Hello, vinyl community. So today I thought we'd talk about a topic going maybe a little deeper into music, into my music collection than what we have these last couple weeks. We've talked a little bit about the Stooges and the MC5, and today I thought we'd try something a little heavier, a little deeper, and talk a little bit about free jazz and kind of um, my interest in that music and kind of where that came from and how I kind of got there. And that hopefully by discussing that, that'll help introduce people who might not be inclined to be interested in free jazz to explore it and instead of thinking of it as music that was coming from somebody else or someplace else and that you wanted kind of to stay away from it. It was just either too intellectual or too emotional or and I think all of that is really just a fabrication of our own imaginations and a fabrication of what we've read and heard about from other people. I discovered free jazz from an album that we've discussed just recently, which was the MC5. And on this album, on the second side, there's the very last track on it, a track called Starship, which is a real, about 9 minutes long. And it's a real exploration. It's a really wild track. And it was a track that the MC5 had been experimenting with live, kind of early in their, when they first got together and as they started to learn more and more about kind of, radical politics and about the underground scene, in the United States at that time, was full of kind of free thinking and the changing morals about music and culture and everything. And John Sinclair, who was the band's manager, was a big proponent of all that and really helped educate the guys in jazz music, but taking them much deeper into it than just kind of the surface level. And so he was showing them all this like radical thinking, the White Panther Party and that kind of free and radical politics, which I think is really an important part of understanding the five. But also telling them about jazz music and not just jazz music, but the deep stuff. And so the song is co-written to Sun Ra. And I remember at the time I was kind of curious about, who I had no idea who Sun Ra was. And this is back before, today Sun Ra's kind of become like this thing, even among, like jazz people, that all of a sudden it's cool to mention Sun Ra. Well, believe me, in, 1968, 69, there were only a few people who were hip to Sun Ra. And when I was growing up, you mentioned Sun Ra, and people would be, they didn't know who it was. Even when I became a record collector and stuff, you could still find those albums on the shelf for, $25, $30. And so anyway, I started to explore this. I remember I went to a store in Detroit on Woodward Avenue here, and it was called, it's still there, it's a store called Solo Records. And at that time, the store was run and owned by this older gentleman who was always in there with a bunch of other older guys, and they were always playing jazz music. And at the time, I didn't know anything about jazz music, but I thought it was a good place to start asking questions. I wandered in there. I was a regular there. Wandered in there, this young kid, and I said, I'm kind of interested in jazz music, and there's a name that I have that I'd like to find some of his music, and do you think you could help point me towards it? And they kind of looked at me and laughed a little bit, and they said, well, who are you looking for? And I said, I'm looking for this guy, and his name is Sun Ra. And they laughed at me. They looked and they said, Sun Ra. And I remember, very well intended, very, very, nice, and just, Sun Ra. He said, that's not jazz music. He said, that's a joke. He goes, that's not where you want to start with, jazz music. And I was like, kind of like, no, that's kind of what I'm curious about. That's what I'd like to hear about. And so they started to turn me, they played some records in the store. It was like this Dixieland jazz stuff that was just, I was like, well, if this is jazz, and I don't want anything to do with it. But eventually he kind of could see my resistance to it, and he shows me over to a bin, and yeah, and I pick up this Sun Ra record, and which is probably one of the more popular titles. And this is really not, to be honest with you, this is really not free jazz at all. I mean, this has some little sections in it, but this is really composed, and this is a pretty easy Sun Ra record to like and to get into it. But it was my introduction to that more avant-garde end of jazz music. And so from here, I started to investigate different parts of jazz. And one thing that I found out was I just wasn't interested in, I bought Kind of Blue, and I bought, the early Coltrane stuff and Sidewinder, and it just didn't really do anything for me. I found it to be kind of, I'll be honest, I found it to be kind of dull. It was kind of boring. Now, I realized that there's a lot of talent there, and it just wasn't for me. And so, but I did get excited when I heard the more free areas of jazz music. And that music appealed to me and inspired me to want to go, deeper into jazz music. And so, at first I had a hard time putting my finger on all of that. It was only through hit and miss of buying records and saying, this sounds like cocktail music to me, and then another record that excited me and invigorated me. And the more free it was, the wilder, wild is probably the wrong word for it, but the more, that's what got my blood pumping, and that's what got me excited about the music. And so over time I kind of started to discover. I have a nice little free jazz section in my collection now, and I guess one of the things that I wanted to say was that everyone kind of wants to point you to like these albums that flirt around a little bit with free jazz. And I think that maybe that's the wrong advice to take when you're not coming from jazz and you're interested in like, what's this? I'm hearing something here. What is this? And then you're referred to an album that's maybe, kind of borderline, or maybe has some flirts around with free, but doesn't really go into it. And then I think a lot of people just go, it's not for me. My advice is, if you're going to get into free jazz, if you're going to explore it, jump into it. Just jump into it and find the right ears that you can listen to that makes, what at first seems really difficult to listen to, and that eventually starts to sound, you start to hear it with a whole different set of ears. And that's a hard thing to explain, and probably other people could do it much better than I do. But that's kind of my advice. Jump into it. And so I wanted to show some records anyway. That maybe would be, first one would be, this is probably my favorite free jazz record. It's not completely free. This is Roscoe Mitchell Sound. And this is a pretty interesting album, and I think you get a pretty good dose. Now, it's not entirely free. There are compositions here. And so, but this album is full of sound and tone and texture, and that's what Mitchell wanted to do with this record. 1966, I believe, and great sleeve too, by the way. But really wanted to explore sound in ways that really, 66. Of course, there was free jazz before that, Ornette Coleman, and but it was really starting to get adventurous and really starting to get interesting, and Roscoe Mitchell was a big part of that. And he also was a member of a band, and this is another highly recommended. In fact, this might be a good starting point, right here. This is the Art Ensemble of Chicago, Fanfare for a Warrior, and this is it's a beautiful record, and there are parts of it that are lush and then there are parts of it that are frantic and wild, and this is a pretty wild place to start, and it's in some ways it's kind of a full dose, but I think if you're gonna explore avant-garde jazz and free jazz and you want to jump into it, this is a really interesting place to start. This music for me, it tells a story. None more than on this record right here. And you really hear a kind of adventure happening, a story being told through the music and through the sound. And, the other thing that I would mention is, political, free jazz tends to be pretty radical and in its politics, and for good reason. And I think that that's a part of it, and kind of being open to that, and exploring that along with the music that you're exploring. I think this does a lot of that, and this is a record you can still find pretty inexpensively, and it's well worth the $25 or whatever you might spend on it. Fanfare for a Warrior. So those are kind of two, older releases. And I pulled out a bunch of records here. Here's one that I've been listening to a lot. I got this a couple years ago. I found this through Stunt Rock Confusion's live stream. He played a little bit of this one day. And Milford Graves. So what this is these are a series of sessions that went on 76, and it just gives you the dates. There are no song titles or anything like that. And this is pretty, I'd say this is a full dose of free jazz. And you're really going to hear the music. It's powerful and exciting and full of amazing floating textures of sound and color, just explosions of all of that. And that's kind of how you have to start to think of it if you're really going to enjoy this. Now, these sessions, I believe, if I've got this right, that Milford Graves did these sessions right before he cut. There's a kind of a classic free jazz record called Bebe, and it's a pretty amazing record. I'd love to find a copy, an original of it one day. It's one of those records that I think sells for, $1,000 or whatever, to find an original. But I might have to just decide to get a reissue. But this can be had on Bandcamp and still at regular prices. I think so anyway. And it's a double album set. And the nice part is it comes with a really nice interview that really helps kind of give you the background. And I encourage you to, when you're exploring free jazz, be very cognizant of the kind of what's going on around just the music, rather than just, kind of listening with your ears and to the sounds. I think that it helps a lot to really understand the motivations of the music and the musicians to see change happen and to want to change the nature and to inject freedom and a spirit into jazz music that they felt had kind of started to get washed away. That jazz music had become too related to people sipping wine at a table, and they wanted to inject it with some danger and some power again, and that that's what they did. So that's another, I think, really good record to jump into. Probably less free This is one I got turned on to. This is Steve Lacy. Um, and this is mainly his solos kind of put together. Um, I think it's really extraordinary. And this is pretty, Steve Lacy tends to be a little bit more on the lyrical, not that there's no vocals on this, but the music tends to be a little more lyrical. And I think that if you want something that's a little bit more, I don't want to say accessible, although this might be a little bit more accessible, this might be a good place to start. And this is an amazing record, and you can call this beautiful. This is a really beautiful record. And another kind of, I think, great place to start that's not too expensive. Free jazz is kind of sometimes associated with another, for lack of a better term, I'll say spiritual jazz. Some people don't like that term, spiritual, although I think it does define the sound a little bit, and I think it's useful in that sense. So you have free jazz and spiritual jazz, which tends to be much more composed, much more melodic. And sometimes the two of those kind of can mesh together in some nice ways. Here's a record that I think is pretty accessible and mixes, the ideas of free jazz and spiritual jazz, like a White. And this is a truly beautiful record. Yeah, this has some interesting instrumentations on it, so you're not hearing the kind of music that maybe you normally would think of when you're thinking of jazz or free jazz music. And there's violin and other instruments that really make this a really interesting journey in music. Yeah, check it out. This is a record I got recently, and it kind of reignited my interest in free jazz when I heard it a few weeks ago, and it really kind of got me to pull all those records out and start to listen to them. Not that I was ever, not into it, but sometimes you go through little phases in music, and certainly this helped inspire a renewed free jazz phase. And Joe McPhee, this is a pretty interesting record. So Joe, he's known for, his first album I think was called Nation Time, which is a pretty intense free jazz record. I used to have a reissue of it that was real good, and I had some illusions about trying to find an original. They gotten pretty expensive. But this finds Joe going in a little bit of a different direction. And while it's not that there's intensity there, but it's not the kind of punch that maybe on Nation Time that was there. This explores a mix of electronic keyboards with the sounds and textures moving, lots of open space, and really a deep listening experience. And it's a beautiful record. I just love it. And I got kind of lucky and found an original, which I'm really happy with. This is a record you want a nice clean copy too, because there's lots of moments of silence in this. And it's nice to not have that snap, crackle, and pop. I'm not always so bothered by that, but it is nice to hear a nice clean record without too many flaws in it, and especially on a piece of music like this. This is a really deep, intense exploration, but also with moments of clarity and beauty that are flowing through it as you're going on the journey. Very emotional record, and yeah, I really like it. 74. So, just a couple more, not to bore you. This is a record that I really, really like. And this does a pretty good job of mixing the elements of free jazz and spiritual jazz. but leaning a little more, I think, towards free. And yeah, this really, this was intended, musicians on this, which was the Black Unity Trio. This was very much done as a tribute to Islam, and in a kind of communicating with God, and that was their intention of the musicians, and you really can hear that. It's adventurous and wild's the wrong word for it, but it's adventurous and very, very progressive, but also with these beautiful lyrical moments and tributes to God and to man, and music is often said to be a dialogue between us and the greater powers of the universe, and this record really touches on some of those themes, and forget trying to find an original of this. And this is a nice reissue, a little bit expensive, but worth it. And I'd encourage you to check that out. Anyway, I think that we can kind of stop there. I have a few other records, but maybe we can hit those up some other times. I think the point is that I was this young kid who was interested in rock and roll music and the MC5, and then got interested in kind of political aspects of the MC5, and then from there I started to discover the cultural things that they were starting to experience, which was free jazz and then kind of radical thinking in politics and all of that. So it's a fun and interesting road to start to walk down, and maybe no more appropriate time than ever right now to start with a little radical listening and a little radical thinking, because we might just really need that. So hope you got something out of that. I hope so. Like I said, I'm not a jazz expert. I know what I like when I hear it, and that's the direction that I go in. I'd encourage you to do the same thing. Don't worry about knowing every session or every player. Find what you like, and then go into it. And if you're going to explore free jazz, rather than going for watered down versions of it, I say go for it, and jump into it and let the sound overwhelm you. And I think that if you do that and you're open-minded about it, you'll hear something that's just going to change the way you look at music and hear music, and that can never be a bad thing. So anyway, hope everyone's okay, and terrible plane crash today. Don't want to be political, but we need people working in the FAA, and we need people in government who make our lives safer. And this closing down of things and holding back federal money from things is a radical and terrible idea. And hope everyone stays safe, and we'll see you.